Hello, I'm Jean Boase-Beier, and I'm translations editor at ARC Publications. I'm going to be talking to one of our translators, Philip Wilson, today. And the book that we're going to be talking about, Philip's most recent book is with ARC Publications, is this. This is a chapbook, a little collection of the poems of Karl Marx. And just to tell you a bit about Philip, Philip is a translator. He doesn't only translate poetry, he translates various other things as well, but he has translated quite a lot of poetry, including also another book for ARC Publications. And Philip is also an academic, and he teaches the philosophy of literature and philosophy of religion at the University of East Anglia. And what we're going to do is Philip is going to read just a few poems from this collection, and then we're going to have a little discussion about the translation. So over to you, Philip, now.
Thank you very much, Jean. Karl Marx published only 2 poems, although he actually wrote well over 100 that have survived. I'm going to read one of the 2 poems that he actually did publish, and this is called Minstrel. The armed minstrel is a standard character of German Romanticism. The armed minstrel embodies both the beauty and the terror of art. In Marx's poem, he's an alienated figure, and he has been interpreted by critics as a revolutionary waiting to be born. Minstrel. Minstrel bows the strings. His light brown hair hangs down. He has a sabre by his side. He wears a torn and pleated robe. Minstrel, minstrel, why play so hard? Minstrel, why is your look so wild? Why does the blood leap? Why does it flow? It will soon tear your heart in two. Why do I play? Well, why do waves roar? To shatter in thunder on the shore, to make eyes blind, to make the heart swell, to make the soul play itself down to hell. Minstrel, your mockery crushes your heart, but your craft was granted by some bright god, and you must go glisten on sound's own waves and strive up to the dance of the stars. What's that? I shall thrust without fail my sabre, black-blooded, into your soul. Get out of this house and out of my sight, unless, you child, you'd wager your neck. God does not care, God does not know art, which thrust in my head from hell's own mist, when the brain goes mad and the heart turns bad, things that I learned from the prince of the night. He beats out my rhythm and chalks out the score, and faster the death march I draw, must play the dark, must play the light, till string and bow will break this heart. Minstrel bows the strings. His light brown hair hangs down. He has a sabre by his side. He wears a torn and pleated robe. Marx wrote many poems to Jenny von Westphalen when he was a student. He would later marry Jenny, and she would support him in his career as a philosopher and as an activist, for example, by editing his work for publication. This particular poem, Abendstunde, Evening Hour, is written in the tradition of German Romanticism. It's very, very, very reminiscent of the work of Heinrich Heine, whom Marx would actually get to know in Paris. And here we have it, Evening Hour. The lantern burns so softly and casts a mellow light. It seems to weep beside me, as if it knew my plight. Again it finds me lonely and sunk within my breast, where ghostly forms of shadow by fantasy are dressed. It somehow seems to realise that its poor guttering part will pale before the fire that deeps down in my heart. But that fire is fading, and it can never be. I only have weak radiance that shines from your soul's sea. Marx was also a gifted satirist, and obviously Marx was when he was writing poetry as an undergraduate, though first studying law, he engaged a lot with philosophy. And one philosopher who was to have an influence on all Marx's work was Hegel. Hegel influenced Marx massively, But Marx reacted against the abstraction of Hegel. And in this satirical poem, which is actually called Hegel, we see that Marx making fun of Hegel by saying that lots of words can just be a cover-up for saying nothing. Words do I teach, mixed up and confused in a demon's true frenzy. So let everyone think, just what they choose they may think. At least they are never hemmed in by shackles of sheer limitation. For out of the roaring flood, plummeting down from the rock, so does the poet invent words and thoughts for his own true beloved. And what he senses, he sees, and what he feels, he invents. Each can then suck for himself of wisdom's nourishing nectar, and I've told you all because I've just told you nothing. I'd like to end then with a satirical four-liner, which again this time is attacking philosophical abstraction in the persons of the philosophers Immanuel Kant and Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who are absolutely up there in the German canon of philosophy, and yet Marx chooses to poke fun of them. Kant and Fichte like to soar to the ether, seeking there a distant land. But I just seek to be a scholar of what I found upon the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip, for reading us those poems. Now, we've got perhaps 10 or 15 minutes or so, and what we want to do now is just have a little bit of discussion about the actual translation. This is just to remind people it's this book, and one of the poems was actually that Philip has just read had the title The Evening Hour, and that is also the title of the book. It's Evening Hour, not The Evening Hour. That's the title of the book. And for anybody who's interested in getting the book or looking at other books, other things Philip's translated, or other books translated by other people, you can go to the website of ARC, that's ARC Publications. But aside from all that, we're going to talk a little bit about the translation, and I think one of the things that's really interesting about this is that most people don't associate Karl Marx with poetry, and because they don't, they might also think, well, isn't this rather a strange person to translate into English? So I'd like to start by asking you, what made you want to translate Karl Marx into English?
Well, I guess I was one of these people who didn't associate Karl Marx with poetry, even though I've actually taught Karl Marx in philosophy courses at UEA. And one day my colleague David Aritza was actually just working through a version of the collected works of Marx in English, which had been donated to our office. And David suddenly said, did you know Marx wrote poems? And there seem to be quite a lot of poems in this book in English translation. And I then found the German as well. The English translation seemed to me rather out of date, but this gave a whole new meaning to Marx as a writer to me. I then kind of forgot about it for a while, but coincidentally, I became interested in some other figures with whom you don't identify as poets, but who did write poetry. For example, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who's been a great interest of mine. I discovered one day that, yes, he wrote a poem. It's a comic poem, which is saying thank you for the gift of a pair of socks, which you've been given for doing some gardening work. Now, again, we tend to think of Wittgenstein as a very serious figure, you know, this great philosopher, and suddenly you get this comic, mock-heroic poem. Nietzsche, of course, saw himself as a poet and wrote quite a lot of poetry, which is published. And then I came across French poetry by Simone Weil. Now, Weil didn't write very much poetry, but the poetry she wrote was extremely important to her, and she was hoping to get this published. In fact, as is known, she died tragically young, and this was not published in her lifetime. But again, I've been working on the Weil publications, and this should be out next year. And it might have stayed there, but about just before COVID struck, my friend Helen Tierney, who's a freelance musician in North London, organised a poetry walk of Highgate. And she said to me, we will actually be passing very close to the grave of Karl Marx. Would you actually, you know, you've talked about Marxist poetry to me, would you actually read a poem in German and maybe read it in English as well? So I got to work, and I chose Evening Hour because it's a poem I do like. And so on our poetry walk, we actually stopped at Highgate Cemetery, and looking up at this huge statue of Marx, which is so famous, I read the poem Abendstunde in German and then read the English translation. So at that moment, I really thought, yes, I think these poems ought to be available. So when I got an opportunity to write a chapbook for art, which is what I think is actually extremely exciting venture at the moment, to put out this series of chapbooks of poetry translation. When I got this opportunity, I immediately thought, well, yes, Marx would actually be great for this. So if you're asking me, what made you want to translate Karl Marx, I guess the answer is going for a walk.
Well, okay, yeah. Oh, that's interesting, because there's all sorts of different ways that we arrive at the people that we do end up translating, and it's not always the what you kind of expect, I suppose. Another thing which I think is always going to be interesting, or it's going to be an interesting question when you translate somebody who's not basically known as a poet, and it's not, the answer isn't obvious, I think, or maybe it's not even an easy question to answer. Was he actually a good poet, would you say?
Yes, I think that's actually is a difficult question. I think the thing is, you can't really just say yes or no to that one, so I'm going to talk about it, and I think we have to actually start with the fact that Marx was actually very dismissive of his own poetry. I emphasize again that Marx wrote his poetry when he was young and was actually hoping for a career as what they would have called in those days a man of letters. He also wrote a novel, some of which has survived, much of which he burned. He also wrote a play, again, some of which has survived, and much of which he burned. And as I said earlier, he wrote well over 100 poems, but it's all written in a very short period of time. And then he came to the conclusion that he actually just was not gifted as a poet, and turned away from it completely. But he did say in the letter to his father, where he actually said, I am not a talented poet, I am giving up. He did say, but my poetry does have, and I quote, a warmth of feeling and a striving for poetic fire. Now, clearly Marx did realise that he had talent, and he realised that his true talent did lay elsewhere. And obviously Marx has become an astonishing figure both in philosophy and in world history. It's been estimated at one point 50% of the world had regimes that claimed to be following the teachings of Karl Marx. But as for the poetry, I think at the very least we can see them as competent pastiche. Many of them read as if he's ventriloquizing the German romantic poet Heinrich Heine. And of course, competent pastiche is an achievement in its own right. It's not breaking new ground, but it's expressing feeling within the German tradition. Now, I mentioned this poetry walk in Highgate, and I was talking to my friend Mark Fielder, who was on the walk. And Mark is a history teacher in London and actually teaches Marx. And Mark actually said to me, oh, when I thought we were going to listen to a poem by Marx, because we've been listening to all these amazing poems by recognised poets who lived in the area. And, he said, we're about to listen to this poem by Marx. I thought, oh no, this is going to be dreadful. And he said, no, I quite enjoyed it. I thought it was actually really good. I really liked it. So again, we see this effect that Marx's poetry is having so many years after it was written. And when the chapbook was published, I showed this to my colleague Rupert Reed at the University of East Anglia. Now, Rupert is an environmental philosopher and an expert on Wittgenstein. And Rupert didn't have very much time, so he was flicking through the book, and he came across the satirical poetry at the end, especially the poem I was reading, the one about Hegel. And Rupert actually started laughing and said, this is really funny. And I think, again, we see so many years after the writing of the poem, this is actually having the effect, which I think is the effect Marx would have wanted from that poem, to make somebody laugh. Simon Armitage, in his recent Oxford lectures, has talked about, he was talking in the context of Bob Dylan. He said there are poems around that we can call not great poetry, but certainly interesting poetry that ought to be read. And I think that's what's happening here. I do think that Marx is an extraordinarily intelligent person. And I do think that if he had persevered, he would actually have made it into the German canon, but probably as a minor poet. And I think it's very significant that when he met Heinrich Heine in Paris, they were both political exiles, they actually formed this bond. And I think Marx could actually see in Heine the sort of person he could have been. And Heine, I think, saw in Marx the sort of person he could have been as well. It's also very notable how literary the philosophical work of Marx is. It's full of these memorable phrases like the ghost of capitalism haunting Europe, or the fact that the workers of the world have only got to lose their chains. And Das Kapital, capital, has been seen by some scholars as a satire. They say it's actually a real mistake to read it as this scientific tract, which is actually going to analyse capitalism, and you can actually just unlock it like a piece of maths to bring down the world. No, it is a satire. It's more like a satirical novel. And again, we remember that Marx, did see himself as a novelist as well. He was extremely influenced by Tristram Shandy by Stead. That was his favourite novel. So, and all Marx's style, all his rhetoric has roots in this poetry. So I suppose we know Marx through the Marx of the statue, through the communist regimes that dominated the world. We know Marx through the writings of Engels and of Lenin and of these other Marxist theories. And maybe it is time to return to the man himself to see if he can speak to us today. And I think that's where the poems can actually help us. A young man who's falling in love, writing all these poems to Jenny von Westphalen, a young man who is entranced with nature, a young man who is starting to engage with the philosophy that will dominate his life. And he's responding poetically to it as well. So is Marx a good poet? It is a difficult question, and in some ways it gets a difficult answer. And at that point I shall stop, not having said yes or no.
Yeah, thanks. It is, well, yes, it is an interesting question. And as you say, it's difficult. It's a difficult question to answer anyway, I think, because poetry, what is good or bad poetry, it's often a subjective thing. But I think the thing, from what you've been saying, the thing to remember about Marx, of course, is that he was a very good writer. And if you're a very good writer, even if you don't normally write poetry, if you're a very good writer and you know how poetry works, then you put those two things together and you're going to get poetry, which is maybe not great, but it's going to be good. So it's certainly good poetry, I think. I mean, I think it is. I think it reads very well, both in the original German and, of course, in your translation. So just in the remaining minutes, maybe you could say a little bit about the translation. What sort of strategies or procedures even did you use in translating Marx's poetry? Could you say something about that?
Sure. Obviously, this is, Marx died in 1883, and he was writing these poems in the early part of his life. So this is literature in history. So I think when we start approaching texts, older texts, we always have to we start with the first thing is to do some research. Now, I knew Marx's theoretical writings, but now I read biographies and I read critical work about Marx. For example, S.S. Prava's book on Marx and world literature, which kind of maps Marx's life and career through his engagement with literature. He was obviously a writer of literature when he was a student, but for all his life, he was a reader of literature. I read what survived of the novel. I read what survived of the play. I read other poems that he wrote. I read as many poems as I could find by Marx in order to make the final selection, because obviously one point about a chapbook is it's actually very short. That's the purpose of the chapbook, really. I also reread the poets who'd actually influenced him, such as Schiller and especially Heinrich Heine. And that enabled me to actually write comments to introduce each poem. I think ARC Publications got many enlightened practices, but two I'll single out. First of all, placing the source text opposite the translated text. I think that is invaluable for everybody. It's great for people who actually know the language in question, but it's great for people who don't. If I'm actually reading, for example, a book of a translation from Chinese, etc. Now, I can't read Chinese, but I can look at the shape of the poems. Actually, I can see whether stanza forms, etc., have been maintained. So I think this is a really enlightened process. And also now the chapbooks are having these short introductions, because these are poems from the past, and we do need a bit of context if we're actually going to enter into that. It's just like when you go to a poetry reading, poets usually give a little introduction to a poem before they actually start reading. It's quite rare for a poet just to read poems with no introduction whatsoever. And speaking of reading, that's what I think translation is. I think translation is close reading. That's something David Constantine taught me. Translation is close reading. And when you do read Marx closely, you see that this is very traditional verse. Marx clearly heavily influenced by German Romanticism. He uses rhyme, full rhyme. He uses a very strong sense of rhythm. He uses classical forms at times where the rhyme falls away, and he writes an imitation of Greek and Latin forms. This is something that Goethe and Schiller pioneered in German. He's very, very fond of the sonnet. He writes endless sonnets, it seems, to Jenny. And I wanted to maintain this sense of formalism in translation, given that every translation is a representation. Now, if I can borrow some words from Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, the one who wrote the poem about socks, Wittgenstein talks about language games, that when we have any piece of language, we'll have various games going on it. And I want to try and play the same games in translation that Marx was playing in his work. But at the same time, I didn't want to come up with anything which was stilted. I didn't want to do something which ended up as a caricature by letting the form run ahead of the content. And I think here I've always found Philip Larkin an influence here, because I think one thing Larkin was able to do was to write verse which actually, when you analyse it, is actually extremely formal. But at first, you often don't know that if you sort of teach it at A level, etc. Students often say, this is free verse. And actually, when you point things out to them, you actually say, no, it's actually got quite a tight rhyme scheme. It's actually got quite tight rhythm. It's actually based on an old form. So I think that's the notion of using the form to support the meaning rather than to clash with it. And again, I allowed myself the liberty of using slant rhyme rather than Marx's full rhyme. Because as I said earlier, Marx did write to his father that he felt, in spite of what he saw as the shortcomings of his verse, he thought that it had a warmth of feeling and a striving for poetic fire, and it's a striving for poetic fire which for me makes Marx worth reading. And that's ultimately what I wanted to maintain in translation.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip. Yes, and I think I agree with that. I mean, that it does have, however you define poetic fire, I mean, that's certainly what it has. That's what makes this book so interesting to read. Not just the fact that it's Karl Marx and it's unexpected, but it's it's very well worth reading, I think. Okay, well, we've come to the end of our time, so we must stop there. So thank you everybody for listening to us, and bye.